Harry has said afterwards that that time serving was the most normal he's ever felt.
I think people loved him for it, and he was a hero at that time.
It was a hugely significant moment, and you can see just how much from the way he was speaking, you can see how much he had become part of that military community, and he was just one of them.
And I think that was a real wake-up call to him as well. And I think it was a hugely important moment in terms of shaping Harry as well, and shaping who he is, taking him out of that royal bubble.
Welcome to Royal Exclusive Rewind, where we delve back into the files and relive some of the highlights and lowlights of royal family history. Remember to subscribe to us here on the Royal Exclusive YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. We often talk about the royal family carrying out service and what that means. Well, in 2007 and then again in 2012, Prince Harry served in Afghanistan in the war on terror against the Taliban. First, he spent 10 weeks as a forward air controller in Helmand province, then as an Apache helicopter pilot. He has since caused controversy by writing about his Taliban kill list in Spare, but his experiences also motivated him to set up the Invictus Games for wounded soldiers. Joining me to discuss Harry's military history are royal experts Bronte and Jack Royston. Guys, welcome.
Hello.
To the show. Prince Harry, okay, serving twice in Afghanistan in the army. This is possibly his highlight, I would suggest,
sure.
of all his time in the royal family history. Take us back to when he first served, because we weren't meant to know. It was meant to be kept quiet, but it did sneak out. What happened, Jack?
So he always wanted to serve, but then there was this big question of, well, is that too dangerous? You know, it was a messy war, Afghanistan, and lots of casualties. So he got permission, and he was flown out there. He was a forward air controller, which is the guy who basically calls in the airstrike. So he says, okay, we've identified a target. We've been watching it for a couple of days sometimes, and we are happy that there's no civilians there. So he would then direct the bombers in to go and take out the Taliban. But he saw a lot. He saw more than that. There were times when he went out on patrols. He saw a kid in a wheelbarrow with his legs blown off, hanging out of the wheelbarrow, and they tried to go and help him, and then the Taliban attacked. So it was a really difficult experience for him at certain points. Other points, he said it was very boring. He felt like he was in a waiting room waiting for the war to start.
It was very important that, because the Afghanistan conflict, I remember, the coffins coming back, and I remember it was a front page of many newspapers for a long time, that the war effort. It was very important that the royal family got involved, and that Prince Harry, the Queen, the head of the army, the grandson, actually went off and fought. But it was kept secret, wasn't it, Bronte?
Well, he had spoken about the fact that, when you're trained for something, it feels your purpose is to then, of course, fulfill it and use those skills. And so, and to the earlier point, it clearly was a time when he felt that he had purpose, and he was in, this is something we've seen with spares over the years, it can be very difficult for them to find purpose. And so the fact that he then got involved, and of course there was a huge risk. He had tried to go to Iraq, I believe, just prior to that, and had been turned down because of the risk. But in this case, there was that understanding across the board that there would be a media blackout, and for such an obvious and serious reason, of course, everyone agreed to that for a while, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But yes, it was very important, and as we now know, particularly when Harry's spoken about it, it was important to him. And then that moment when he came back and Princess Anne gave him the medal, and the whole family was there supporting him, it was a very significant moment for the royal family.
But it was cut short. And
yes.
We are to blame, not us here in this room, but the media were to blame, weren't we? Because there was meant to be a blackout, obviously for reasons, safety for Harry, and also safety for the other soldiers. They want to draw attention to his out. They might have put his colleagues in danger.
Well, that's what Harry said when he was told. I think he was 10 weeks into what was supposed to be a 14-week deployment. And it first emerged, unfortunately, on an Australian publication, New Idea. But it actually flew under the radar for quite a few weeks. It was only when it got picked up by the Drudge Report, I think it's US political news website, that's when it became global news. And of course, that's when the risk really came in for Harry. But as he wrote in Spare, when he was told that the decision had been made that he would be extracted, his initial reaction was to want to argue the point, but he knew it wasn't about him so much. His reason for holding back on debating them on it was, of course, the fact that it was going to put the entire base at risk.
And he was actually, he was listening in on the radios at the point that it emerged that he'd been outed, and he heard them discussing him. his call sign was Red Fox. So he heard them on the radio saying, Red Fox was being compromised, and talking about their concern that there would be a Taliban ambush and they'd try and wipe him out, basically. And it was the next day after that the SAS came and flew him out. So it was obviously, in a sense, heartbreaking for him. But I think the colonel who kind of sat him down and talked him through what was going to happen did say to him, a lot of the top brass never wanted you to go out to begin with. So you dodged them, you dodged the Taliban, and 10 weeks is a pretty good stint. But
he returned a couple of years later. He went back as an Apache helicopter pilot, maybe more on the front line than he was before. And this time, the press, the dastardly Australian press, kept it quiet. You're to blame for all of it, Bronte. Just to point out to everybody, it wasn't you. But,
just to be really clear, I don't work at New Idea, nor have I ever. It was not me.
But it was kept quiet, and it was a little bit more successful. He managed to see out his full stint, and the press did go out and interview him while he was there. And I want to ask what you think of what he said. He basically admitted that he was shot at and he shot back, which is what you do in a war. It shouldn't be surprising. But he said, if there's people trying to do bad stuff to our guys, then we'll take them out of the game. And it's this kind of language that I think, a soldier might say, or someone might say to someone that got into the press and caused a little bit of controversy. He also says, I'm one of the guys, I don't get treated any differently, and our service towards our country and the military will always come first. What do you think about Harry's second stint in his comments?
Well, it's interesting you said that, that it is something you'd probably expect soldiers to speak with that sort of language. Harry has said afterwards that time serving was the most normal he's ever felt. And for someone who was born into the position he was born into, that would be a very significant thing. And also bearing in mind, I think at that point he would have been still third in line to the throne. He was in his 20s. And, to hear him speak that way and to be serving, in an active, on the front line, it was something we hadn't seen since really, I want to say Prince Andrew again. I really need to. Then Prince Andrew, obviously, in the Falklands. So it was a hugely significant moment, and you can see just how much from the way he was speaking, you can see how much he had become part of that military community, and he was just one of them in that regard.
It's important to state that young British men from towns across the country, and also in other countries that took part in the war in Afghanistan, were flying out to Afghanistan, and they were dying, and they were coming back with missing legs, with missing arms. It was a huge thing that was affecting our country at the time. To have him almost as a figurehead coming back talking about the war was very important, Jack.
I think people loved him for it, and he was a hero at that time. And I remember that interview he did. He's sat on the tarmac and they're talking to him. There's a point where, the kind of alarm goes off and he just rips his radio mic off and runs and jumps in the helicopter. He was co-pilot gunner of an Apache attack helicopter. So he was one pulling the trigger. People loved him for it. The forces loved him for it, and he did put his life at risk. He could have died, and he had a couple of near misses at points. And there was also, a point when he got flown back from his first tour, where he was in the back of the aeroplane, and the curtain kind of blew to one side, and he saw that there were 3 really seriously injured British soldiers with him. And I think that was a real wake-up call to him as well. And I think it was a hugely important moment in terms of shaping Harry as well and shaping who he is, taking him out of that royal bubble and, the Eton bubble, and showing him a slice of, the life that other people live.
However, for all the praise that he received for these 2 tours of Afghanistan at the time, has he slightly ruined it with the comments or the words that you wrote in Spare? Because you mentioned about their flying back. I think one of the chaps on there was, we'll talk about him in a minute, but Ben McBean, who he said, I'm not a hero, this guy's a hero, who later said that Harry shouldn't have written what he did in Spare, where he talked about a kill list and how many people he killed and talking about taking them out like players on a chessboard.
It was that language, players on a chessboard, I think it's quite cold, of course, and quite clinical. But also, so Harry's reasoning that he's given since then about making the decision to list the number of people that he'd killed was that he said that, going through all this in silence has not been effective for getting through the things that they've had to experience and getting through the trauma and being in a war. So that's his argument for it. But then, as you've said, a lot of people in the military community, and particularly high up, have said this is not how we behave. It's not notches on your rifle strap. And it was it was a moment where Harry has been such an important part of the military community, and he's always seemed to be very embraced by them, even when things have been difficult elsewhere. And it was a real moment where I felt like there was a split, because a lot of people were publicly condemning him speaking out in the way that he did. And also, as it was pointed out at the time, there's a myriad of reasons why it wasn't a good idea, not least of which is that his ongoing security concerns have been a major headline for the last 5 years, and that can't have helped. But also it can be used for propaganda for these groups, on the other side. And so, yes, he's clarified why he said that, but I still find it to be very baffling, and I do think that it was a mistake, and as we now know as well with the lens of time.
And the Taliban commented on it at the time, and like you say, it was actually the pieces on the chessboard line that they picked up on rather than the number. But I think, the number is just quite crass, really, and I'm sure that there is an element of it, whatever he might have said publicly, there's an element of it that is him needing to give stuff to the book to justify the huge price tag attached to it. And he just needed to give them as much as he possibly could. So, the more of that kind of stuff he gave them, probably the less royal secrets he had to throw in there. But I think it was a mistake. I think when he said they were like pieces on a chessboard, he was being honest. And he had said previously that it was a bit like playing a computer game sometimes, because everything you're seeing through a computer interface. But it was a huge mistake, and this is something that Harry and Meghan did, numerous times, is that they had the support of millions of people, but over time they kind of forced these different groups to break ties with them, basically. And this was a moment when Harry really weakened his connection with the military community.
However, the Invictus Games, that has strengthened, his links with the military community. I mean, that's something that was. I think he saw the Warrior Games in the US, and he thought this was something that he could replicate and make much better. But he does have credibility in this sphere, because he has served, and because the Invictus Games is a hugely important thing to wounded soldiers across the world.
Absolutely.
I think it's really authentic as well. Like, I think he really cares about those guys. Yeah,
and there's no doubt that the way that his career with Invictus and the passion he's put behind that is all born of him serving. So it's been a great outcome in that regard. I do think that, as we were saying, the kill count part was a very disappointing misstep, I believe. But on the broader scale, of course, the work that he's done with the military community is greatly respected.
Should he have stayed in the armed forces, or could he have stayed in the armed forces?
I think that, he technically probably could have done. I think he found kind of being a desk head in the armed forces very boring. I think he liked it when he was out in the field or training to go out into the field. I don't think he really enjoyed the backroom role that he got moved into, but he could, I think, have stayed on in it. Leaving and doing Invictus, I think, was hugely positive for him, and I think he probably does prefer getting on the ground, working with charities and working with causes, to being stuck behind the desk at the MOD. Was he happiest there, do you think, Bronte?
I think he was. I think, and again, I'm referring to his own words in Spare. It just felt like for the first time we do now know he felt so lost. He never really felt like he was he never really felt like he fit in at any of the places he'd been before that. And it is always the Spare curse as well, of just sort of stumbling around trying to work out how you're going to fit into it all. And I think that during that period, he really did have purpose, and it does seem like he was just one of the guys, and he really enjoyed that. It was the first time in his life that he'd had that experience.
Earlier, you mentioned Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, as we now call him. So both Andrew and Harry, the Spares, both served in the armed forces. Does that mean we're going to see future royals? Probably not George, but maybe Charlotte or Louis serving in the army.
If they want to. I hope that they're able to, but with social media and the way the world is now with the 24/7 news, it would be so much harder to keep, that media blackout that existed back in it didn't even last the whole 14 weeks, but that sort of thing now you've got to imagine would be so much more challenging. So it depends.
And I don't think William and Kate would push them into it, but I think William might try to persuade. I think they probably will do some kind of service, but whether or not they go to the front line, I mean, I suppose the first question is, will there be a front line to go to?
True. Or Archie or Lilibet.
And I would say probably not Archie and Lilibet. I think that George will serve in some form. I think there's a good chance that Charlotte and Louis might do something with the military, but you've also got to think about the changing nature of modern warfare, where it's all drones, and it's only going to become more kind of robotized as time goes on. So who knows what warfare will even look like in 10, 20 years' time.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate that. We did a lot on Harry and his time in Afghanistan, so I appreciate everything you said. That's all we have time for on Royal Exclusive Rewind. But join me next time for some more royal nostalgia when we open the files and relive another iconic moment.